thank you for joining us. It's always especially intimidating to have such great speakers and such an erudite panel. It's doubly intimidating when the session is scheduled for just around lunchtime. So it's particularly nice that you have all joined us this afternoon. We're discussing an important part. You know, there's so many different parts to the discussion on China. Today's session is called China's Power, China's Folly, and I think there should be a question mark after that. Since there's really no question that since 2008, we have seen a different kind of China's rise. And why do I say 2008? Because many may think this has happened very recently, but actually we're in the 15th year of a very significant shift, if you like. After the Olympics that China hosted, we saw two or three things. Many of them were acutely felt in the neighborhood, whether it was China's economic rise, in particular during the global economic financial collapse, the Blue Water Navy with China's new strides in the oceans, strengthening of China's territorial claims. And if you remember, in 2013, it came to a head really when Xi Jinping, the president, sort of said, we will reclaim every inch of land that China claims. What we've seen is definitely a shift from the 1990s that our authors have written about, and Deng Xiaoping's hide your light, bide your time type of rise for China, to the Xi Jinping era, as it's now being called. In India, the disquiet has grown, and as the books written by our panelists today really document, especially since 2020, when Chinese soldiers amassed along the line of actual control, and the rest, as they say, is history. China now rivals India in its neighborhood, and there seems to be another confrontation building as India is part of growing coalitions to somehow deal with China in the Indo-Pacific. Our guests today have already been introduced to you, and I should say that between them they have written enough books so that you could spend the next month or so really focusing just on China and what it means for India. But I'd like to come to you first, Mr. Shyam Saran. Your book, How China Sees India and the World, really looks at the underpinnings of the China-India rivalry, and not just in this recent space. I should tell those of you who haven't read it, it's in 240 pages. You go through 40 centuries of China-India history, and it's definitely a must-read. You've, in there, spoken about China's attempts to reimagine history in many ways. You've even said the Belt and Road initiative is a way for China to claim legitimacy for a kind of Asian hegemony. Do you think this is at the base of what we are calling China's folly, this idea that China must reinvent history in order to rule the future, if you like?
Thank you, Suhasini. Let me begin by saying that, all countries tell stories about themselves. And I think it is not at all surprising that China also has a certain story to tell. And that story changes as your current capabilities, your power also change. You begin to find other ways of trying to tell your story. And what is the purpose of that? The purpose is to seek historical legitimacy for the exercise of power that you wish to do now. That is essentially what you are trying to do. So in China, essentially the story is we were always number one as far as Asia is concerned. And it is only a small historical aberration during the so-called century of humiliation, starting from the Opium Wars up to the point that China became liberated in 1949. This is a continuous history of empire, of domination of Asia, cultural domination, as well as political domination, economic domination. While the history actually is very different. China speaks of itself as I said, a continuous empire. Not many people know that through half of that history, it was always under alien rule. Even when the revolution took place in 1911 and China became a republic, the empire ruling China was a Manchu empire, was the Qing empire, not Han Chinese. Similarly, you spoke about the Belt and Road Initiative. It is as if all the old caravan, routes from Central Asia, the maritime routes across, the South China Sea, the Indian Ocean, all these had as the nodal point China itself. Nothing could be further from the truth. The Silk Road was not one road. The Silk Road was several roads which, connected the western part of China, but also Persia, India, lot of other Central Asian kingdoms, and not only with the West, but also with the Indian Ocean. So, this was a much more complex history than perhaps is being told. And the idea is really to seek legitimacy through a rewriting of history. There is no doubt that China is today one of the most capable countries in terms of economic strength, military strength, even technological strength. So it should actually seek a role for itself on the basis of what it has achieved today, rather than keep harking back to what happened in the past.
All right, very interesting. And very quickly, you say in there, in the book, there is a chapter on India as a negative example. Is China, in a sense, does it see India as the counterpoint to it in any way, in terms of India being a democracy?
Oh, most certainly. But this point about a negative example, for 1,000 years, up to about 1000 AD, India was looked upon as a teacher by positive example, because this was the land of Buddhism. This is where Chinese pilgrims, monks used to come to the famous universities of Nalanda or Vikramshila to gain knowledge. This was actually, in a sense, the knowledge capital of Asia.
Yes.
But from about 1000 AD, partly because of the Islamic invasions which took place in India, partly also because Buddhism in its own land of birth actually became a more and more diminishing faith. So the kind of connections which were there between India and China, constant connections during the first millennium, progressively in the second millennium, the countries actually became strangers to one another. Yes, some maritime trade continued, and very flourishing trade, but it was limited to just the trading communities. So India and China essentially, lost touch with each other until they encountered each other again only during the colonial age.
Right.
And at that time, the India that China confronted was an India that had already become part and parcel of the British Empire. And for example, during the Opium Wars, who were the foot soldiers who actually defeated Chinese forces? These were the Indian soldiers. Who were the policemen in Shanghai in the concessions? They were Indian. So there was this sense that here is a great civilization, but look, it has now become a slave nation. Why negative example? Because this is not what China's future should be.
All right. Very, very important ideas over there. And, if you put the latest books of our three speakers today end to end, you'll actually get a continuum of sorts. So I'll turn to Manoj Joshi and the book that was introduced at the beginning, called Understanding the India-China Border. And it's really about managing the line of actual control from about 1962 to the present. And in there, it talks about really the future of where the current border conflict and tensions will go. And Mr. Joshi, in your book, you have said that the root cause of the current crisis is that China no longer sees India as an equal. You're referring, of course, to the 2000s and 2008. In a sense, coming from what Mr. Saran has said, do you see this as the real problem, that China no longer sees a space for India in Asian leadership?
Well, you see, the whole thing, the border can be looked at in two phases. In the first phase, there was a genuine issue that we got to settle the border. When two republics in 1950, brand new, a month old, got together, they had an undemarcated, undelineated border. And area which is inhospitable, high mountain region, and uninhabited. So the normal, these things of border were very difficult to pin down. It needed the two sides to sit down and to negotiate the border. That's what new countries did. But in India's case, for a variety of reasons, we refused to negotiate. We said we know where the border is. And we told the Chinese, you guys should understand that we know where the border is. Now, after the war, the border was quiescent till about 1975 when there was a small incident near Tawang. 4 Indian soldiers died. Since then, there have been numerous standoffs. In Sumdrong Chu in 1987, Doklam 2017. Then, of course, we had the Galwan incident. Now, the problem was that this border we were talking about, line of actual control. Line of actual control was a Chinese invention. Basically, a Chinese invention to shove the border down the border in Ladakh down our throat. You know, so they just said, line of actual control is which you actually control, but actually that wasn't really true. It's so difficult to even grasp. I have a scholar in London who's trying to do something about the line of actual control. I said it's very difficult for anyone to grasp that when Zhao Enlai says that we will talk of this actual control line, he doesn't provide a map with it. So there is no map. So there is one line of actual control which the Indians believe, one line of actual control which the Chinese believe, and there are places, 18 places where they overlap. And again, none of this is marked in a map. And this is all in an uninhabited area. So it's very difficult. He calls the river something else. I call this mountain something else. So this is the background of the line of actual. Now we've tried to settle it. I mean, we tried to settle through talks after 1980s. Then after Mr. Vajpayee as foreign minister went there. Then in 1993, we took a step, very important step. Both of us were going on our economic journey, economic liberalization journey. So we said, let's put this thing aside. Let's say there is a line of actual control. Let's try to refine the points where there are differences. The problem is that the Chinese refused, meaning when over the next 5, 6, 20 years, when we said, let's sit down and define those places, those 18, 20 places, work them out, the Chinese evaded us. And they have, again, an extremely elliptical, elusive way. When Prime Minister Modi went there, he again told them that let's define the line of actual control. And what happened was that the Chinese said no. And then a junior Chinese official was fielded out, and he said that, we can't define that line of actual control, there'll be problems. So the Indian journalist asked him, what problems? He said, that is beyond my remit. Now, it was that elusive. So the line of actual control is elusive, and the Chinese are utilizing that line of actual control now. This is the second phase, to basically keep India off balance. They're using because of their good logistics and their strength along the LAC to keep India off balance. It no longer has to do with the border actually being settled. It now has to do with the larger geopolitics of South Asia and the Indian Ocean region.
And the leader. And of course, it's a shift because in 93, 96, they did agree to maps. And in fact, the book that Mr. Joshi has written really has a lot of very interesting maps. If you read these terms, in newspapers today, we all talk about point so-and-so or, a PP so-and-so. His book gives you a better understanding of all of those. And then you come to the period of what we are seeing today. Vijay Gokhale has been a diplomat there. He's been an ambassador there. He wrote about the Tiananmen Square protests, what he saw of the time. He's written about engaging China in the long game. But his latest book really looks at after Tiananmen and the rise of China that we saw after those protests through the 1990s and beyond. The fact is that this period of India-China confrontation also coincides with a new look at China. China is unpopular, it is seen as aggressive, it is seen as unpopular, and in a sense unpleasant as well. When you look at the concept of wolf warriors, when you look at the idea of China's complete lack of transparency on the COVID pandemic, for example. What do you see as the causes for China's decision to perhaps go from that quiet rise that you've documented to this more unpleasant phase, if you like?
Thank you, Suhasini. I think the reason I wrote that book was I think there's a dire need for an Indian perspective on China and to understand why China has become a great power. And the two real underpinnings of that book are firstly, that after the 1989 Tiananmen incident, the Chinese political leadership took real risk in doing reform when logically they should have dumbed down, assuming that the Tiananmen incident was in a sense something to do with destabilizing the regime, and they could have reversed the reforms, but they chose to move ahead. And the second was there was a relative relaxation of authoritarian control that allowed for an explosion of ideas, of innovation, of entrepreneurship. Now, essentially, what we are seeing after 2012, which is when the current leader has come to power, is a backtracking of that. I think there was perhaps an impression in the current leadership that the policies of 1990s and 2000s had outlived their utility, that China was already a major economic power, a major diplomatic influence, a strong military power, and that therefore such suggestions of Deng Xiaoping as hiding our capabilities and biding our time, or having good relations with all our neighbors, or having a multi-alignment policy was really no longer necessary, because China is a major power recognized as such and everyone has to accept it. And therefore there is this visible shift in policy after 2015 in particular, where China sort of becomes more assertive on the external front and becomes more conservative on the domestic front. So that you see actions against the private sector, against technology companies, against what they call the platform economy, the digital content providers, the ideological congruence that the leader is bringing by making Xi Jinping thought something that everybody from the primary school to the factory unit should study. And I think what we are now seeing in the post-COVID period are, in a sense, the chickens coming home to roost. The realization in China that all this has, far from making China a stronger, safer, better country, created doubts in the minds of the international community about where China is going and what it means for us.
All right, so the next question, and I'd like to put it to all our speakers, is really coming from what you just said about China not being seen as unassailable anymore, as the inevitable sort of global power, given how it has handled COVID, but also what it's doing to its economy. This year, India is now the world's most populous country. We've pipped China to the post, and many are seeing even that as the beginning of China's problems when it comes to growth. So the question I want to ask you is, in this, does Xi Jinping face any kind of threat at all? We saw the great crowning that preceded all these problems just a few weeks before.
So I think the collapse of COVID policy is a catastrophic policy collapse. We can't describe it as anything else. They go from a zero COVID policy one day to literally removing all restraints on the next day. And I think this says something for the Chinese state. It is a politically brittle state where so long as they are in control of things, it's fine. But when they lose control, they lose control. And this is the second catastrophic collapse. The first was the 1989 Tiananmen incident. So the question is, how do they recover from that collapse? Deng Xiaoping was smart enough to press ahead with economic policy reforms, to bring social stability into the system, not to take any strong actions which would, in a sense, inhibit the population, and they were able to come back. What the current leader does, I can't say. At this point, I don't see him doing very much. There has been a Central Economic Work Conference at the end of December, which has said all the right things so far as reform is concerned, but on the ground, whether this actually happens, and I doubt it will happen because there is a strong ideological justification for this regime. If that doesn't happen, then I can see a lot of challenges coming up in the future. But, China doesn't have a tradition of throwing out its leaders so easily. So I guess we may be having him around for the next 5 years or so.
All right. Well, he's certainly given himself ample space now by doing away with the notional term limits. Mr. Saran, I'd like to ask a few questions about how India has dealt with China's rise so far. One of the places where, of course, we are seeing a pushback has been perhaps at the line of actual control, where Indian forces now match Chinese forces. But in many respects, it does seem as if India's response is actually just a defensive one. That when the Chinese come in, for example, in Arunachal Pradesh a few weeks ago, that India's response is to ensure that they can't come in, but it's not much more than that. On the trade front, actually, we're seeing India and China hit record highs when it comes to India's imports from China as well. What do you make of India's response to this rise of China?
Let me say that until the incidents which took place at Galwan, you actually have a very successful policy on the part of India, at least since the visit of the then Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi to China. From then on, in fact, what India was trying to do was, there is a mix of both cooperation as well as sometimes, if not confrontation, at least restraining China in some way, and that policy worked. I mean, for several years, there were areas of convergence where India and China could work together. My own experience as a climate negotiator, for example, I can say without any reservation that at Copenhagen, for example, one of our great allies in those negotiations was China. There were other international issues where India and China, in fact, found common ground. So it was a mixed picture, but essentially I would say that, yes, there were incidents at the border, but essentially peace and tranquility was maintained at the border. And what is very interesting is that, one of the conferences that I went to, Beijing, there was already questions being raised about Chinese aggressiveness and China's, being very, very assertive about its territorial claims, expanding those claims, in fact. The then Chinese Vice Foreign Minister in his speech said, look at India and China. I mean, their relationship is the model for the rest of the world. We have difficulties, we have conflicts between each other, but we know we are very mature countries who are able to handle this in such a manner. This is how international relations should be. We have come a very long way from there. So I don't think we should throw the baby with the bathwater and say, because we have had this problem, everything that we did in the past was wrong. No, that is not the case. But we are facing a different situation. And that different situation, to my mind, is linked to the changing, power balance in the world. The asymmetry of power between India and China has dramatically increased, and it is still expanding. So Chinese, for example, in the last few years, whenever we start talking about, the behavior of China towards India, their constant response, oh, but our Indian friends should understand, our GDP is 5 times your GDP, things cannot be exactly the same as before, we have to adjust. So it is very clearly, from the Chinese point of view, Chinese, if I know anything about Chinese history, it comes out very clearly, the Chinese view of power is very hierarchical. Harmony is linked to hierarchy. Everybody should know his place in the pecking order. And if you try and be more than what you are in the pecking order, you have to be put down. So there is one is the geopolitical canvas against which this relationship is playing out, and the second is the manner in which China looks at power and the manner in which India looks at power.
In fact, I would always say that no matter what China says they have over us, I have the Sholay line, which is "Mere paas maa hai" or "Mere paas democracy hai." For those of you not from India, that means at least I have democracy. So I want to ask you this question, Manoj. In your book, you have a lot of details about what has happened at the line of actual control since 2020. But as a journalist, I'm shocked by how little information actually is coming out about the present confrontation between India and China. On the official level, it seems all that we get are certain words that, China has attempted to change the status quo, for example, or that China has amassed troops along its side of the line of actual control, or the Prime Minister's famous, no one has come inside, no one is inside Indian territory. Do you think that the lack of information in the last few years on the situation of the line of actual control could actually be very Chinese in its own way, but could actually become a kind of Achilles heel for India? Or do you think we are, by keeping this kind of discreet silence, by not taking on China in that very overt way, actually helping the situation?
Well, all I can say is that I'm a professional journalist by training. For me, the suppression of information of any kind, I think, is counterproductive. I know government people will have a different point of view, but I think suppression of information here is very important because one very interesting thing is that in 2020, China blockaded us at 5 points in eastern Ladakh. When I say blockade, because there were areas of dispute, we would mutually patrol those areas, both of us, and they suddenly established blockades. Now, 3 of those have been removed, but not removed in the sense what they have done is they have created a no patrol zone there. And some of those no patrol zones actually adversely affect us. See, the one near Gogra and Hot Springs, the no patrol zone, falls on the Indian, large part of it falls on the Indian side of the LAC. And mind you, this is an area where even the Chinese accepted the border in 1960. They had given us the latitude and longitude. And the fact that the border ran along this particular watershed, they had no dispute in 1960, even before the war. Now there's a no patrol zone there. Worse is Depsang. Government of India has not uttered the word Depsang, meaning in government statements, you don't hear it. But the largest area which has been hit by this blockade is Depsang. 972 square kilometers, we are no longer able to patrol because the Chinese have established a blockade. And we have been trying to discuss, this is one of the last areas which we are going to discuss, but my own guess would be eventually they'll create a no patrol zone there also, you see. And this is something which they consider strategically very important. They consider this very important because they think India could launch an offensive against their road, against their Aksai Chin road, using that particular area. So they are particularly sensitive to this. But equally, it seems that the government of India is sensitive to it. One of the generals who was associated with it said that this is a legacy issue. But this is simply not true. It is not a legacy issue. Our last patrol went there in February of 2020. And after that, it was blockade.
We have not been able to. So this is very interesting because, of course, Mr. Saran, you wrote the committee report in 2013 and 2014. It's now public record, so you don't have to be inscrutable bureaucrat about it. But essentially looking at some of these border areas and the kind of reinforcements that India needs at the LAC. So I just want to bring that question to you as well. What do you make of the way the current conflict has been treated in terms of the public information?
You know, when you are faced with a military sort of deployment and infrastructure which continues to be far superior to yourself, that one should be prudent is self-evident. So I don't think that the adventurousness on the part of India is the answer to the problem. One, I would like to point out that part of the reason why we have been having these issues is precisely because we have started doing a much better job of border management than we have in the past. One, our infrastructure in the border areas today is significantly better than, for example, when I first started the border infrastructure surveys as Foreign Secretary in 2004. If I look at what we have achieved since then, in terms of transportation, in terms of better conditions of deployment for our forces, Don't forget, I mean, these are some of the most inhospitable areas anywhere in the world. And so you now have much better infrastructure which allows them to, live in these areas with some degree of comfort. So your deployment time, for example, today is much better than what it was before. So I think we should take cognizance of that. And part of the reason why we are seeing this reaction from the Chinese side is that they are becoming nervous about the pace at which India is actually improving its infrastructure. So there is a
There's a causative
there is- yeah.
relationship
And
there.
I think I would also say that the present strategy that we are following, I take the point that Manoj has made, but I would also make the point that India engaging with the Chinese in these various rounds of military and diplomatic talks is actually good policy.
All
You know,
right.
it has achieved some results, and hopefully will achieve some more results. But I think from our point of view, placed where we are, having this kind of a process of conversation, of engagement, and trying to come to compromises wherever possible, I think that continues to be the right strategy to follow.
All right. Now, I do want to come to questions from the audience, so get them ready. Mr. Gokhale, I do have one last question for you. You were ambassador to China and then subsequently foreign secretary. When we came through what was seen as the Doklam conflict, Doklam crisis, which actually started out with Bhutan and China. And my question to you is, that conflict seemed to pass within a few weeks. And it was almost seen as very much to India's advantage the way it worked out. Yet just 3 years later, we see this conflict that is now going to go into its fourth year as of this April, with no end in sight, with more aggression, and also the horrible loss of lives at Galwan. How do you compare the two, and why do you think one was not resolved like the other?
I don't think the two are comparable, Suhasini, simply because we never claimed that Doklam was part of India. This was a case where our view is that Doklam is a part of the Kingdom of Bhutan, and China says it's China's territory. And our concern was that they were using Bhutanese territory to get to certain strategic points which would permanently disadvantage India in a military sense. So this is very different from Galwan. But you would remember that the Sumdurongju crisis of 1987 also took 8 years to resolve. And that took 8 years to resolve because the Indian army correctly occupied the key heights. And the Chinese simply could not dislodge the Indian army from those heights and eventually had to accept that the Indian army was going to keep those positions. So to that extent, I think there is no difference between Galwan and the Sumdurongchu crisis. And we just have to hold certain positions until the Chinese realize that we are not going to go back. And I have no doubt that that's the strategy the government is following, and I'm hopeful that the results will be the same as Sumdurongchu. But we are in for the long haul, and with China, there's no question of any shortcut.
Certainly, and in the Sumdurongchu conflict ended with an entire agreement on how to manage the border. Could I just see with a show of hands how many questions there are, and then I can try and come to as many of you as possible. Do we have a mic? Why don't you start with the two, the first row and the second row? Yeah.
This is a question to all three panelists. You spoke about the asymmetry of power, and I think one of the things we need to recognize also is the decline of America and how it shaped Indo-China relations. Is it possible to see the India-China conflict without looking at it from the American context?
All right, very interesting. Is it possible, could I just take a few more questions and then I'll come to the panelists? Maybe the lady here in the front row? Oh, okay, go ahead. Quick question.
Yeah, good afternoon. Don't you think that this whole Chinese intrusions, etc., in a way, though it's sort of a historically accepted concept now that they've been on this for last, 70 odd years, but isn't it that China is equally worried about the fact that India is now, say, getting closer as far as the Indian Ocean and the Asia-Pacific area is concerned with regard to Quad, and that this is one way to put off India? That is number one. The other thing is, having personally seen Tawang, West coming and East coming districts myself, being in the forces earlier, Upper Siang and Dibang Valley is still, we have the closest that we have roadheads are still, about hundreds kilometers behind, whereas China have got these villages forced or forward policies, so to speak, where they have these villages in Upper Siang, next to Upper Siang and
Sure.
Dibang Valley.
The
So what about that?
All right. So one question on the US, one on, of course, India and the Quad, and the lady over here.
Hi. There is a conception that China has actually occupied large parts of India, and the government's narrative is very different and in denial of this. So I just want to know, is this true?
All right. Very pertinent point. I also have two questions, very similar in nature from the readers of the sponsor Rajasthan Patrika. Abhinav Kumar has asked, recent news के मुताबिक इंडिया ने चाइना के population को suppress कर दिया है. I presume we have outpassed them. और इस इंडिया कैसे अपने favor में ये ले सकता है? So that's a question about India now being number 1 in population. The second question is on the same subject from Ravesh Gupta, who says China की population का कम होना और China में चल रहे anti-communist protest का क्या कोई connection है? I'm not sure how that works. I suppose the one child policy isn't being asked in questions. Can we go quickly around? Maybe just take a minute each to answer some of the concerns, and I'll take one more round of questions. Go ahead with you.
Well, the thing is that when it comes to the US, our point is our balancing has to be straightforward with China. We are a power of some substance. We must develop our comprehensive national power. Whatever the US may be or may do, our problem is in the heights of the Himalayas. And that's where we have to, because that's what the Chinese are using, the unsettled border out there. So I think Quad is okay, Indian Ocean okay, but the point is eventually our clash with them is straight across the Himalayan area. Just one point on demography. See, demography is okay. Demography favors India is fine. But unless and until those people are educated and skilled, a demographic opportunity becomes a demographic nightmare. And I think the Chinese are halfway, meaning they have at least educated and skilled large parts of their population. We have not reached that stage. So for us also, alarm bells should be ringing as far as demography is concerned.
Do you want to take the question from the lady? How much do you think China has taken since 2020?
Well, that's anybody's guess. But no, I want to, we need to move away from an obsession about the boundary and ask ourselves, why is it that when a country is 5 times bigger than us economically and 4 times more powerful than us militarily, they are still so concerned about us? And the reason is democracy. How do you explain to your own people that a country which is as big, as diverse, as ethnically and religiously perhaps more complicated than China, as underdeveloped as China, can still get its people to vote leaders time and again 14 times? When they are not, when that question is posed by the Chinese people, they will have difficulty in answering that question unless we fail. And therefore, it is their objective that India fails. Because otherwise, what is the ideological basis for this Communist Party to exist? And I think that's what we should be bothered about, not the boundary.
As I said, the mere paas maa hai analogy. Mr. Saran, do you want to quickly take the question about why isn't India putting its border villages out there? Why isn't there more people along our LAC?
Well, I mean, I think the gentleman has already served in the border area, so he would know how difficult it is. China has a terrain advantage because the Tibetan plateau is mostly flat, and therefore communications coming right up to the ranges is much easier. While we from our side have to cross one ridge after another ridge after another ridge before you can get to the LAC. So there is a very asymmetrical situation here. Which is the reason why I said that, taking into account that kind of an asymmetry that we have been faced with, I think we have done fairly well in terms of, have we eliminated it? By no means. Do we have to do much more? Of course we have to do much more. But I think it would be fair to say that today, yes, in terms of, trying to get back what has been taken by the Chinese, Aksai Chin, for example, it is going to be far more difficult. But in terms of holding your own, in a sense, holding the line, I think the Indian forces have shown themselves fairly well capable of that. That is not enough.
Yes.
But yes,
All right, we have about 5 minutes. Can we come to this side? There's a gentleman with spectacles who had put up his hand earlier, or has your question been answered? There, right there. Right there. There's somebody with a hand up here. Just go to the person with the hand up. And sir, question please, a very quick one, if possible. No statements.
No. My question had already an answer from Dr. Joshi. Now my question is to the other panelists, very distinguished panelists. Has personal diplomacy failed in the case of India-China relations?
Interesting. Very interesting. And there was somebody behind you. I just see a couple of hands. Maybe you can just pass the mic to that gentleman and then to the gentleman at the back, and we'll close.
Thank you. So my question is, can increasing trade be seen as positive opposed to popular view of it being seen as negative? So at the time of tensions in future, we could see Chinese people considering trade as opposed to land acquisition and military intrusions.
And the last one. The last right at the back.
Hello, ma'am. Hello, sir. My question is similar to the person who was asked earlier. When we talk about the China's folly and we talk about the multilateral forums where we talk about the expansion of and place where India has been talking about the UN reforms and all. But at the same time, we are at a trade deficit of $101 billion with China. Is it playing a hindrance when we talk about our workability with the China?
Sure, perfect. Trade question. And I have time for one last question from the gentleman there.
What impact will the next Dalai Lama will have on the Indo-China relationships?
Okay, we'll have to start a whole new session now. But it's an interesting question about the personal diplomacy, because as we know, Prime Minister Modi met President Xi Jinping 18 times between 2014 and 2020. And 2 of those were one-on-one 6-hour meetings in Xi'an and Mamlapuram. So I'll start from this end, and any questions you want to reply to, and you can pass the rest on.
No, on personal diplomacy, I would say that where there is actually a convergence in the interests between 2 countries, personal diplomacy can reinforce that. But personal diplomacy cannot create convergence where there is no convergence because of, very real difference in the interests between the countries. And as far as the US aspect is concerned, quite obviously, as I mentioned, that it is the geopolitical equations is the canvas against which India-China relations evolve. Now, that is not to say, like some people argue, that are you not provoking the Chinese by seeking closer relations with the United States? My answer to that is that the more, at least as far as a diplomat is concerned, the more isolated you are, the greater the pressures can be brought on you. The more, sort of network of relationships, strong relationships that you have, you are perhaps less subject to those pressures. So I certainly believe that the relationship with the United States or the relationship we have, for example, in the Quad, is something that helps India deal with the China challenge rather than pose an obstacle in that respect.
Mr. Gokhale, you want to take the trade question?
Yeah, I'll take the trade question. Yes, I think it's important not to be fixated on numbers. What is important is a number of our best performing export sectors are heavily dependent on the Chinese. Pharmaceuticals, auto components, textiles, all of our star performers. If you were to cut off trade with China today, your exports would fall and it would be a really bad blow to us. So the answer is not simply to say that 100 billion is unacceptable, let's go to zero. The answer is to develop alternative sources of those intermediate products like APIs for pharmaceuticals, or to do a homegrown version of it, and that takes time. Until then, we have to live with the reality that the global supply chains begin and stop with China, and to some extent our industry will be dependent, and that will be reflected in the trade figures.
All right. And do you want to take any of the others?
Well, since I'm the last person responding, all I want to say is, taking all this into account, the issue of what's happening in the border, the trade issue, the deficit, the United States relationship, all I can say is that one has the feeling that a period of opportunity is opening up for India now. See, whether you look at it demographically, whether you look at it in terms of our multilateral relationships. Now, but the point is, we need to work on them. I mean, simply say that this opportunity, it'll come and sit on your head, that's not going to happen. The Chinese are also very diligent people. They work very hard. The Communist Party, despite the gobbledygook that they come up with, they are very competent people. They have removed 800 million people out of poverty. For us, that's our biggest target. How do we remove 800 million people from poverty, which means we've got to become richer, much richer. And that's our main target. And all this other stuff, and the Chinese are experts at distraction. So they have Pakistan on one side to distract you, they have someone else to distract you, and they will distract you because, as Mr. Saran said, they have an hierarchical worldview. In that hierarchical worldview, there's only one number one in Asia, which is China.
Right.
And we've got to contest for that space.
All right. Thank you so much. I just want to wrap this up. I want to wrap it with a line I received from a very, very wise diplomat whom I asked about how does India deal with China in its neighborhood in particular, where, China is really trying to make inroads. And the answer was to be the un-China. So I guess there are many ways to look at this problem, and we hope you do join us again. But you've been a great audience, so thank you. Round of applause for yourself, really.